Okay, um, let's just make sure that it's working. Looks like it. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala abdillahi wa rasulih Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So we're going to continue inshaAllah ta'ala with our weekly Q&A session. It's brought to you from Newcastle Central Mosque. And inshaAllah ta'ala, we have a number of questions, quite a large number of questions to deal with, inshallah. So we're going to get through as many as we can. We're going to go back to some of the questions that were submitted last week. We got up to question number 106, as far as I can remember. So the first question that we had is as follows. I have some old football shirts and the teams have a cross on the team logo. Can I give these to a charity bin for the poor in countries such as Syria or not? And if not, what should I do with them? So I think the first thing we need to do here is establish what a cross is, because there is a misconception which a lot of people have, is that anything in the shape of a cross, it has the ruling of a salib, of a Christian cross in Islam, and that's not true. The shape of a cross, in a general sense, could be present in many things, but it has to be a cross which is a Christian cross, or something which came originally from a Christian cross. And that's why, for example, one of the issues which comes to mind is the Chevrolet badge. So the Chevrolet badge, I remember some of the students when we were in Medina, and they used to make inkar of the teachers who had this. They used to be upset with them, and used to say to them that this, how can he drive around with a car with a cross in front? However, when you look at the history of that shape, it appears that it has nothing to do with Christianity, nor does it resemble a Christian cross at all. So you have to be careful about these things. However, football shirts often do have things that have an origin in the Christian cross, like the flag of St. George, for example, the English flag, which is a Christian cross. That's where the cross on the English flag comes from. And indeed, many of the countries that have that cross on the flag, it comes from Christianity, and it is intended to symbolize Christianity. So these things, we don't think that it's permissible for a person to wear them, and especially in a general sense. So if something is not permissible for a person to wear, then it's not permissible for a person to give, or to for someone else to wear, because if it's haram for you, then it's haram for them, and that doesn't make any distinction whether we're talking about the Muslims or the non-Muslims, because the non-Muslims are required to follow the rules of Islam just as the Muslims are. However, they can't do so until they enter into Islam, but that's they're still blameworthy for not following the laws of Islam, the individual laws of Islam. So here I think that a person has one of two, or first of all has two choices. They have to decide, is it really a Christian cross, or is it just the shape of a plus, or the shape of of two lines that go across each other? So if it's a Christian cross, and you can be sure that that's the origin of it, then you have two choices. Either you can blot this cross out or remove it, unstitch it, remove a piece from it so that it doesn't form the shape of a cross anymore, and then you can give it. Or you make use of the material, but don't make use of the actual cross. So it could be that some of these charitable organizations, I'm not sure, do some of them use the materials instead of the actual garment of clothing? Might some of them use material and be able to take the material and recycle it in some way, or could you give it to a recycling service that use the material in some way? This is inshallah. And if not, then make use of the material in some way. Use the material for something useful at home. Use it as a spare cloth or something like that. But I don't think it's allowed. If it's not allowed for you to wear it, it's not allowed for them to wear it. But you do have to establish it's really a cross, because I think there's a lot of exaggeration in this. That sometimes any sign, to the point that some of them said you can't write 1 + 1 because that plus is a cross. Well, that's not what Islam came with. What Islam came with is the prohibition of the Christian salib, the cross of crucifixion. That is what Islam prohibits. And yes, they are of different shapes. If you search Wikipedia, the Christian cross, you'll see some of them are equally sized. The Orthodox cross is equally sized. The horizontal and vertical lines are fairly equal, but it has a particular shape to it. Once you've established that logo is representative of a Christian cross, then you can't wear it, and you can't give it to someone to wear. But what you can do is you can blot it out, remove it, blot it out, or remove the stitching, or you can give it to somebody, or you can give it to someone to use the material. And Allah knows best. Someone asking that I had mentioned using a tissue or a pad inside of underwear, but is it allowed to do so in a state of ihram? Yes, if a person has this problem, a person has the problem of leaking urine during their day, then it is permissible for them to wear something underneath their ihram to catch this. That is, of course, for the situation of a man. As for a woman, her ihram is her ordinary clothing anyway. So there is no issue with the woman because she doesn't have an ihram as such. But the man, yes, the man can wear something underneath to hold that tissue in place. But it doesn't have to always be underwear. I mean, there are solutions for this. It could be held in place in a different way, or it could be with some kind of like garment that is specifically designed for this problem that you take from a pharmacy. So in any case, this is something that is permissible for the person who is suffering from this kind of problem, and Allah knows best. If someone works as a doctor and it's not impossible but impractical to pray at a specific time, can they combine prayers when they return home? I can't remember if we did this one, but I wanted to go over it again in case we didn't. Allah Azza wa Jal said, "Inna as-salata kanat ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta." The prayer has been fixed upon the believers at specific times. And alhamdulillah, we know so many brothers who are doctors who pray on time, walillah alhamd, in many different fields. And I think that the question was very honest in the sense they said that it's not impossible, but it is impractical. At the end of the day, your religion is more important than that impracticality, and it has to be done. However, there are a couple of situations we could draw attention to. One is that occasionally, if you combine between Dhuhr and Asr, and then separately between Maghrib and Isha, there is no harm in that if it's occasional. Because, for example, a person became really, really busy with something which was very important, and they got to the situation where it became very hard for them to pray, and they delayed Dhuhr till Asr time, then this is occasionally, this is okay. Because the reason that you can combine the prayers together is al-haraj, al-mashaqqa, difficulty and hardship. So if that difficulty and hardship exists from time to time, there is no harm. But as for people doing it all the time, this is problematic. And say every day I combine Dhuhr and Asr. But if a person, from time to time, the odd day, something happens, emergency happened, they became busy, and so they combine Dhuhr and Asr, or they combine Maghrib and Isha, then this is something that from time to time it could be done, but not on a regular basis. So it's really important that the person finds a way to make that work. And they find a way to make it work, because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Al-ahdu alladhi baynana wa baynahum as-salah, faman tarakaha faqad kafar." The difference between us and them is the prayer, and whoever leaves it has disbelieved. Is it possible to list quickly the major sins as opposed to the minor sins? I would recommend, it's a very good book, which is a book called The Book of the Major Sins. I think that's what it's called. It's called The Book of Major Sins by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, rahimahullah ta'ala. and they sometimes write it as by Muhammad ibn Sulaymân at-Tamimi. Who is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab? That's the same. There's no difference. It's a different name for the same person. So it's called the Book of Major Sins. It's called the Book of Major Sins. And this is, inshallah, a very good book in this regard. But a person might ask the question, how do I distinguish between major sins and minor sins? So the major sins are those sins which Allah Azza wa Jal threatened punishment, the hellfire, His curse, His anger, the punishment of the grave, the punishment Yawm al-Qiyamah, or those which Allah described them as being severe or great in the sight of Allah, and a great transgression in the sight of Allah. These are the major sins, the ones that come with a specific threat of punishment, and those which Allah Azza wa Jal described as kabir or azim, great or significant or major. These are the sins that come under the major sins. So, for example, do we find that alcohol, if you look at drinking alcohol, do we find that it has a specific threat of punishment? Likewise, the had, there is only a had only for the kaba'ir, the shari'i punishments, the punishments in the sharia only for the kaba'ir, for the major sins. So if we look at drinking alcohol, it has a shari'i punishment for it. And there is a threat of punishment Yawm al-Qiyamah. There is a specific threat of punishment Yawm al-Qiyamah for it. So this makes it from the major sins. We look at zina. The Prophet ﷺ described the people who committed zina and their punishment Yawm al-Qiyamah. And Allah Azza wa Jal described it as fahisha, as an immoral act. وَمَقْتًا وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا. Allah Azza wa Jal described it as an evil way. So ultimately, Allah Azza wa Jal described it as an evil way. So these are all things that indicate that it is from the major sins. And then if you look at, and so on, you look at anything which there is a specific threat of punishment for, there is a had in the Sharia for it, there is a specific prescribed punishment for it, or Allah described it as being severe or being major. These are all from the major sins. And as for the minor sins, they are the things that we know are wrong, but there is no specific punishment mentioned for them or no specific threat mentioned with regard to them. But we know that they are wrong. We know that they're wrong. As an example of that could be a person, they look at something which is haram. So this could be a person, for example, when someone walks past them on the street, instead of lowering the gaze, they didn't lower their gaze at that time. This is an example of that, and it's something we know that it is haram, but we don't have an evidence to make it that it is from the major sins in that surah, in that particular way. But there is another issue, which is that minor sins don't stay minor if you do them without any regard and without any concern, and you keep on continuously doing them. Then they're not considered to be minor. They're considered to be major sins, because a major sin includes a minor sin which you do continuously without any care for it. So it could be a minor sin like swearing. We know swearing is haram. We know swearing is haram, but it's not a major sin. But if you do it constantly and without any care, you don't actually try to stop yourself or care about it, so then it becomes a major sin. And it's not the sin itself, but it's the fact that you don't care that you're disobeying Allah Azza wa Jal. And this is mentioned within the ayat that talk about إن تجتنبوا كبائر الإثم إن تجتنبوا كبائر ما تنهون عنه. If you avoid the big things that we have prohibited you from. And the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, الذين يجتنبون كبائر الإثم والفواحش إلا اللمم. Those who keep away from the big sins and the great acts of immorality, except for the small sins. So within this you can find many resources, and the book is a very good book, the book of the major sins. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, he mentioned that the number of them is closer to 70 than 7. because some people have the idea of 7 major sins. There are 7 mubiqat. There are 7 mubiqat, 7 destructive sins, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ijtanibu sab' al-mubiqat." Keep away from the 7 destructive sins. But the number of major sins is closer to 70 than 7. There's a large number now, and Allah knows best. When a person is leading the salah, can they start moving to ruku' before saying the takbeer, so the ones following are not early in following the imam? They can't say the takbeer al-intiqal, the takbeer before. It has to be in the middle part. It has to be during the transition. So they can't say it when they're standing, Allahu Akbar, and then go. And they can't reach the bottom of the movement and then say Allahu Akbar. However, they can say it during the movement. And the scholars differed. Some of them said you should start saying it when you start moving and finish saying it when you finish moving. But generally, it should be during the transition. But I don't see any harm in a person if they delay it within that transition. But as for saying it after you've reached the second position, this is not permissible. And some of the ulama, even though this is a harsh opinion, they said the salah is invalid because of this. Even though this is not a strong opinion, but some of the ulama, they even said this. They said the salah is batila, it's invalid. I don't think it's invalid, but you should not be delaying the takbirah until you reach the position. Like the person makes sajda, and then when they've reached sajda, they say Allahu Akbar. But the person should say Allahu Akbar during the transition. And if they delay slightly in the transition to encourage the imam to go first, there is no harm. But the better than that is to educate the people, not to start moving until the imam has finished the takbiratul intiqal and moved into the position. And Allah knows best. Can the Quran be recited in a position where your legs are stretched out and you're sat up 45 degrees like on a sofa? Would this be makruh? I would imagine it's not haram. I don't believe that it's makruh or haram. Allah Azza wa Jal said, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار. The end of Surah Al Imran. Allah Azza wa Jal said, those people who remember Allah standing and sitting and lying down. And the Quran is the greatest example of remembering Allah. There is no specific evidence that you shouldn't recite the Quran when you are with your legs stretched out, or you shouldn't recite the Quran when you're reclining on a sofa. There is no evidence for this, and I don't find this to be among the statements we found from the scholars. Sheikh bin Baz rahimahullah ta'ala, he said there is no harm in this, there is no harm in it. But a person should have good etiquettes with the Quran, and that means that a person shouldn't be in a state where they're not taking the Quran seriously. So it's important that a person, give the Quran a bit of, give the Quran its proper respect. But there's no harm in reading it when you're reclining or lying down or sitting up or on a sofa or with your legs stretched out. There is no harm in that. But when we say give the Quran its proper respect, don't do something that would indicate that you don't have a respect for what you're reading or attention for what you're reading. So you should be thinking about it and you should be reflecting upon it, and you should be taking it seriously, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. Is it permissible to lie during an interview with an immigration officer if a person is afraid that the application may be denied for being a Muslim? No, we don't think that it's permissible to lie in this situation. And in fact, this could be a really serious situation where a person admits to being from another religion. And this is kufr, is disbelief that could take someone away from Islam. And the person who does this has sold their akhirah for their dunya. The one who, in front of the immigration panel, they say, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Hindu, or I'm so-and-so. Wallah, this person has sold their akhirah. They sold their akhirah for the dunya. They sold their akhirah. It's an evil thing to do. The person who is allowed to express disbelief is the one who is under the threat of death or torture, or they fear that they will lose a limb or something similar to. These are the examples the ulama give. إِلَّا مَنْ أُكْرِهَ وَقَلْبُهُ مُطْمَئِنٌ بِالْإِيمَانِ, except for the one who is forced, is compelled. And some people, they took this ikrah to mean any kind of force, like, oh, we're not going to pay you your benefits this month, I'm being forced. We're not going to give you a passport, I'm being forced. We're not going to let you live in this country, I'm being forced. This is not ikrah. Ikrah is when someone puts a knife to your neck and tells you, I'm going to stab you if you don't say I'm a Christian. This is ikrah. Ikrah is when somebody beats you to the point that you fear you might die. This is ikrah. Or someone genuinely threatens to do that. Someone puts a gun to your head and says, say you're a Christian, I'm going to pull the trigger. This is ikrah. As for, I'm not going to give you a passport, or I'm not going to give you your benefits or something like that, this is not ikrah that is permissible for a person to say that they're not a Muslim. However, there are two things that remain. The issue of concealing the faith, or a person not openly saying that I'm a Muslim, this is a different issue. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he made a differentiation between these two things. There's a difference between kitman, or concealing the faith, and between saying you're part of another religion. If a person just doesn't tell somebody what religion they are, and they don't tell the immigration officer what religion I am, says, what religion are you? He said, I'd rather not say, or I don't want to speak about it. This doesn't fall under this issue. The person is allowed to conceal what religion they are if they feel a harm for them to come to them. And likewise, it might be also a tawriyah, a person who gives a false impression but doesn't lie. Somebody gives a false impression but they don't lie. And this is not allowed in Islam except when there is a fear of harm. But if someone is scared that they will be harmed because of it, they're scared that they might be harmed, then they could potentially give a false impression. And that's where you say something that isn't a lie. You say something that isn't a lie, but you don't necessarily, you might give the person a wrong impression. I don't know, I'll give an example. It's not a good example, but just what comes to mind. Someone says, I am Hanif. What religion are you? I am Hanif. I follow the religion of Ibrahim, or something like that. And this is like, the person is not lying, but they maybe didn't give the answer, that the person didn't tick the box that says Islam. So this is something possible. But this, wallah, immigration, this is a great, wallah, fitna. A lot of Muslims fell into. Wallah, a lot of Muslims fell into that. They were willing to give up their deen, and willing to sacrifice and compromise for the sake of a passport. And no matter how bad your situation is, think of the akhirah. This is more important. And of course, this is not the question specifically. The question, inshallah ta'ala, asked a good question. But just to warn people about how people are willing to give up so much for a passport. SubhanAllah. To the point that I used to remember being in Medina, and people would say that I wish I could change for your place with you. I wish that you could have my Saudi passport and I could have your British passport. Oh, SubhanAllah. You think that, is there any one, and this is jahl murakkab, it's compound ignorance. You have such a blessing, and yet, SubhanAllah, you wish to give it up for what? Like the people of, like the Bani Israel, they gave up the food from Jannah, and you want to give it up for garlic and onions. Allahumma musta'an. May I know if Abdul Hamid II of Turkey was the last caliph? Was he a Sufi, and is it okay to watch the series? I don't know what his belief was in that sense. I don't remember having studied the rulers of Turkey in any great deal. I studied a little bit for the purpose of the mas'ala of whether Saudi actually fought against the Ottoman Empire or not, and whether it was legitimate or not, and whether they made takfir of them or not. I remember this studying this issue, but I didn't look a lot into the Turkish rulers. As for this whole issue of the caliphate, then in all honesty, there is a lot of exaggeration about this, and a lot of foolishness is said. Like those people who say that the caliphate ended in 19, whatever it was, 14 or 17 or something like that. In reality, the Muslims have not been united behind a single ruler since the time of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Muslims have not been united behind a single ruler. And not everything that is given a name should be necessarily bringing along its rulings. So a person can use the term Khalifa, Caliph, but does that actually mean that they were the Caliph who was understood to be the general ruler of the Muslims, and what the scholars will refer to as al-Imam, the main Imam of the Muslims, the main ruler of the Muslims? I don't think this has been true for many, many hundreds of years, wallahu alam, that there has been this kind of unity among the Muslims in that regard. Rather, there have been competing empires and competing countries. Each one of them had their own ruler, and each one of them managed the situation underneath the situation of their own country or their own empire or their own state. So this is an issue which is probably, it needs more time to deal with and more time to research. But other than that, I'm not going to go into too much detail in that. I think it's better left to somebody who has researched the issue in more detail about what the belief of Abdul Hamid was and how we would classify that belief. That needs some further research. As for watching the series, I would never recommend any question that starts with, can I watch the series? Unless it's a Islamic series that is made by, that is like, can I watch the series on description of the Prophet ﷺ or something like that? But as for the series that are produced by non-Muslims, I do not believe it's permissible to watch them. Is it permissible to wear fragrances which contain alcohol? Yes, I think this is permissible, because the alcohol here, I don't believe that it is impure. I believe that it is haram to drink, of course, but I don't think that it's impure. And I don't think that it's forbidden to wear fragrances which contain alcohol, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. Is gelatine haram? Yes, gelatine is haram to eat, unless it is marked as halal. It is haram to eat. There are some scholars who allowed eating gelatine, but when they gave that opinion, they gave it based on the idea that gelatine changes state. So there is something called istihala, which is when something changes state. It no longer holds the chemical properties that it had before. So, for example, you have a pigment which is extracted from insects, the blood of insects, the red pigment. When you look at this pigment chemically and physically, it doesn't resemble the insect at all. There is no resemblance to it at all. It's completely chemically and physically changed. This is what the scholars talk about istihala, when something changes state. Does gelatine change state? From what I understand, it doesn't change state. Not enough for it to be considered something different. In other words, when it is extracted from a pig or a dead cow that is haram to eat, and it then is put into the food, is the process that it goes under before it's put into the food so significant that it has no resemblance at all to what it was when it was taken out? Or is it a case that it's taken out, cleaned up, and put in, basically? We don't think that it reaches the quality, the standard to say that it changes state, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. So you should eat only the gelatine that is marked as halal. If we're taking notes during a lecture, must we write Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam every time we write the Prophet? Yes, you must either write it or leave a space and come back and write it later, or say it at least, but don't write Sad or SSS or SAW. This is bad etiquette with the Prophet ﷺ. And the scholars of Hadith, they used to be harsh upon the person who wrote Sad like SAW. And this is why we see the people these days, it's very ignorant behavior, that people write the Prophet SAW. And this is not the etiquettes of a Muslim. And the scholars of Hadith, they spoke strongly against it. Rather, a person should write Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam or leave a space and go back and write Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam after the lecture has finished. But as for saying it, they can say it at the time. So here a question was being asked about vaccines. And it was a long question which mentioned a lot of the negatives around vaccines, talking about whether they contain potentially tissues from or cultured in animal blood or carcinogens and things like that. Wallahi, this is a matter that requires two things. First of all, it requires medical knowledge of how these vaccines are made, and it requires a committee of scholars who investigate the way that these vaccines are made and make a decision as to whether that is Islamically acceptable or not. And it may be that something becomes acceptable because it is the lesser of the two evils, or it is the least harm to repel a greater harm. However, and even, this issue of being cultured in animal blood and so on, this requires also, further research as to whether that would be forbidden or what the Islamic limits on that would be. However, the default position that I can find among the scholars of Islam until today is that vaccines are permissible. I haven't found any statement from them in which these issues were raised and they said that it is not permissible, or that the vaccine must be halal vaccine, or it must have only been made in a certain way. However, it's not easy to give a more detailed answer to the question because it requires specialist knowledge, and it requires also a committee of scholars to give that specialist research. And generally, this is something that people like the Islamic fiqh councils and the Al-Majma' al-Fiqh al-Islami, the Islamic Fiqh Council, and various sort of organizations, they specialize in this kind of thing. They specialize in getting together doctors and scholars and so on and making decisions about big issues that affect all of the Muslims. So I don't think that really you can give an opinion on something like this, because it's from the major things which affect the Muslims. If you say that it's haram, it's going to affect the lives of millions of Muslims. And if you say that, likewise, if you say it's permissible, so it should be dealt with by a very senior committee of scholars along with medical evidence. And to the best of my knowledge, whatever I've seen of that so far from their fatwa have been that it's permissible, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. There's a question about something called medical alchemy. I think the problem with this question is, not the question itself, but the problem with answering this question is that terminology is difficult to define. So I looked up this word, and you find all different kinds, you find all different things under this topic. There are all kinds of shirkiyat beliefs, evil beliefs, like relating to astrology and relating to all kinds of strange beliefs. But there are also legitimate actions, like people talk about extracting the questioner mentioned, extracting essential oils, spirits and salts from ingredients to assist with better health. Wallah, I think the term medical alchemy, it shouldn't be used. I think it should be defined more clearly and said that, is it allowed to extract an essential oil from an ingredient? Then if the ingredient is permissible, it's permissible to extract an oil. Does that mean that oil will actually work? It doesn't mean that it will actually work, but it's not haram for a person to extract a halal substance from a halal substance. But when we use general terms like that and we say medical alchemy, the difficulty is that someone else might hear that and understand from it, is it allowed for me to believe that if I extract this element under a certain star sign, a certain benefit will happen to a certain kind of person, or I prescribe things for people on the understanding that their star signs, for example, benefit them. So I think the wording is the problem. I think if we take the question was perfectly fine, but if we take the question like, as is it permissible to extract essential oils, spirits, and salts from ingredients to assist with better health, then if the ingredients themselves are halal, it's permissible, but a person shouldn't make unsubstantiated claims that might be considered al-ghish. They might be considered betrayal or cheating people. Like someone says that this has the power to cure every illness or something like that. So a person should be honest about what they did. But extracting oils and salts and things from ingredients, I don't see there to be any harm in that if the ingredients are halal. But we have to be careful to avoid those negative beliefs that came along with that. And that's why even the topic of alchemy is really interesting. If you look at some of the people who practiced alchemy were definitely, they were into those shirky beliefs and unscientific practices. And then you look at others who give the same name of alchemy, like Jabir ibn Hayyan and others, and you see that the practices are much more scientific, even if maybe not all of the things are correct, but the concepts are more, it's not like this. It's more based upon, we do an experiment, we test it, we see if it works, this kind of thing. So in this sense, maybe the terminology is too broad to give a specific answer. But if it's talking about extracting oils and spirits and salts from halal ingredients and there's no deception involved, then I think there's no harm in that, inshallah. Is a woman on menses allowed to recite aloud from the Quran? I've heard when you're on your period, you cannot read Quranic verses. There is no doubt that she is allowed to recite from the Quran. There is no doubt about this. Absolutely no doubt. However, the issue is she allowed to touch the Mushaf? And by the Mushaf, I have a Mushaf here. This is what I mean. Let me look at my video. Okay, maybe the video is not working. But anyways, I'm hoping the video is working. But this is a Mushaf. So if you look inside, it has the Arabic text here. This is the Mushaf. This is what we mean by. This is what I mean by the Mushaf. And as for touching the Mushaf, then it's safer to say that it should only be done with wudu. That's the safer opinion, inshallah. Are verses recited during Taraweeh prayer included in reciting the whole Quran? So just to be clear on that last question, she can recite the Quran from a phone, from a book of tafsir, from the computer, from her memory, but it's better she doesn't open the Arabic Mushaf and recite from it. Are verses recited during the Taraweeh prayer included in reciting the whole Quran during Ramadan? So this idea of reciting the whole Quran during Ramadan, in the first place, we have to understand that it's not a specific sunnah. And what I mean by that is, it's not something that is like, there is a specific act of worship known as finishing the Quran one time during Ramadan. And this is something that generally the Salaf used to do, rahimahullah ta'ala, finish the Quran. Some of them finished every day, some of them finished more than that, some of them finished every 3 days, every 7 days, every 10 days, every 14 days, every month. So there is no harm in that, inshallah. But there's no specifically defined way to do it. So yes, you can include what you recite in the Taraweeh prayer if you wish, or you can separate between them so that you recite your portion from the Quran, from the Mushaf separately, and then you recite in Taraweeh separately. There is no specific evidence to say that one of those is the right way to do it, except that the norm, and Allah knows best, is that usually we do the prayer separately and we do our finishing of the Quran separately. Usually, this is usually more the custom to do the two separately. But if you do them together, I don't think there's any harm in that, inshallah ta'ala. Does the Quran have to be kept up high all the time? We answered that last week, but just to make clear that the Quran doesn't have to be kept up high all the time, but it has to always be given respect. You can put it on the floor if the place is clean, but that shouldn't be like, people could get the wrong impression, or it could be a bad habit and it could get knocked or it could get kicked. But if someone's praying and puts it on the floor for a moment while they make sajda or something, there is no harm in that. But generally, things shouldn't be put on top of the Quran, and it shouldn't be treated like any other book. So there's no, mandatory height for where you put the Quran. During Taraweeh prayer at home, does the Qunoot surah have to be read for a long, and any things after that have to be read for a long time? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his Qunoot was not particularly long, not like the length that we see today from some of the Imams when they, this 15-20 minute Qunoot. And we don't know any evidence for this from the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Qunoot can be short, and sometimes you can miss it out. And as for the Taraweeh prayer at home, pray whatever is easy for you. فَقَرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. Read whatever is easy from the Quran. If the shaitan is locked up during Ramadan, does this mean that jinn possession and black magic can't affect people? No, that doesn't necessarily. That's not necessarily the case. First of all, the statement the shaitan is locked up, that's probably a little bit of a misstatement in terms of translation. The shaitan is chained. Suffidat ash-shayateen. The shaitan is chained, and some of the narrations mention shayateen wa maradatul jinn, the major obstinate devils. The influence is reduced, and maybe the leaders among them are restrained, but there is no evidence to say that jinn possession doesn't affect people in Ramadan. That doesn't appear to be the meaning of the hadith, and Allah knows best. Could you please explain the hadith that a Muslim shouldn't let 2 nights pass without writing a wasiyah? If I was to pass away, and may Allah grant us a good ending, Ameen. How would what I own be distributed Islamically with inheritance? Is this something my wife would arrange, and is it separate to the wasiyah? What's the difference about the two? So this relates to a hadith, and the hadith is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Ma haqqu imra'in muslimin lahu shay'un yuridu an yusiya fihi yabitu laylatayn illa wa wasiyatuhu maktubatun indah." And it's from the hadith of Umar that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, it's not right for a Muslim person who has something that they want to make a wasiyah for, that they should go to sleep 2 nights except that their wasiyah is written down with them. So here there are 2 elements here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he spoke about the obligatory division of inheritance. Allah Azza wa Jalla spoke about the obligatory division of inheritance. And the obligatory division of inheritance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us about it, min ba'di wasiyatin yusa biha aw dayn, or min ba'di wasiyatin yusi biha aw dayn, after an inheritance, after a wasiyah that is given or a debt that is paid. So the way that the inheritance works, and this is a long topic, but we're just going to try to summarize it the best way that we can. Okay, so the first inshallah 5 10 minutes. So the first thing is that there is when a person dies, there are debts that are cleared. First of all, their funeral expenses are paid, and then any debts they have are paid, and then the wasiyah. And the Prophet ﷺ said about it, الثلث والثلث كثير. أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم, he said, a third and a third is a lot. And that allows a person to write down up to a third of their estate to be given to people who would not be their inheritors. Up to a third of the estate to be given to people who would not normally inherit from them. They can't give it to their son or to their, someone who would inherit from them, but maybe they want to give it to a charity, or they want to give it to a friend or something like that. And it can't go over a third of the estate. This is the wasiyah. And if a person has a wasiyah that they want to write down, then they need to write it. Otherwise, people will not know how to distribute their wealth afterwards. After that comes the obligatory division of wealth that is required by Islamic law, the obligatory division of wealth. And here, the obligatory division of wealth is already set in the Quran. However, in many places, it also needs to be written down because the country would also not respect the division of wealth according to the Islamic principles. So in the UK, if I die without an Islamic will, there is no guarantee that my wealth will be distributed according to the Islamic rules and regulations. Furthermore, if somebody has wealth, and it's not known what their wealth is, what do they own, what don't they own, this could also be a problem. So there are three things that need to be written down. The first is a wasiyah in the sense of a voluntary wasiyah, if you have one. The second thing is if a person has wealth that belongs to them that might not be easy to know what is to be distributed. Like it's not clear what belongs to them and what doesn't. They should have documentation of what they own so that people can distribute it fairly. And the third is if they live in a country where the rules of Islamic inheritance will not be followed, then they should have written down the way that they want their wealth to be divided Islamically. I hope that answers the question. Okay. So to say how would it be distributed Islamically with inheritance, etc. In this country, it's very important that you have a proper Islamic will written, so that it would be distributed fairly, because you can't guarantee for the people that you leave behind will be able to do that. It could be challenged legally in the courts, and you don't know what might happen to a person in that stage. Your inheritors could fight over it. So it's important that, instead of leaving it as a matter to leave to your wife to do, that before you pass away, you have written down the three aspects that we talked about. If you have any debts or any assets that would not otherwise be, easily known, and you want to just make a note of the assets you have and the big assets you have and the debts you have. And likewise, you want to give any outside of the normal Islamic will, like a wasiyah, to being a third, up to a third of the estate to somebody different. And the third thing would be that you have written down how to divide your wealth Islamically, and that you want it to be divided Islamically. And there are some pretty good online services that do that for you, which are fairly cheap to use if the thing that you have, if your finances are relatively simple. But if your finances are complicated, then you probably need to get specialist advice on it. And Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. So the next question, and I'm just going to take maybe another 2 or 3 questions, inshallah, then we'll have to stop for today. Paying tax to a country which may use some of the money for haram. what is the ruling on that? So the best information that I have up to now is that it's not allowed for a Muslim to cheat on their tax. It's not allowed for a Muslim to cheat, but you can do your best to avoid whatever you can in a legal way. So as you know, there are many ways to legally reduce your tax bill, whether that be through the way you structure your earnings, the way you spend the money, the way you manage the way you submit your accounts. There are many perfectly permissible legal ways to reduce your tax bill, and accountants can give you advice about that. And they're not illegal. They don't break any rules and regulations. So I think that a Muslim is obliged to do that as much as possible, because there's no doubt that the taxes that we pay are often spent upon haram. So it's obligatory for a Muslim to try to reduce that as much as possible in whichever way they can, but they can't break the law. They can't break the law in doing that. They can't do something illegal like lie about it, or cheat or something like that. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-Muslimuna ala shurutihim." The Muslims are obliged to follow their conditions, the conditions that they agree to. So when you live in a country, you broadly agree that you're going to follow the rules and the regulations. So that's what a Muslim has to abide by that and stick to that. But no doubt a person should try to avoid whatever they can, because the money is not going to be used in an Islamic way. So they should avoid whatever they can without breaking the law. And that's usually what I think most people would try to do. The next thing in that is that also the money you give is not necessarily, if you don't have a choice, you have to give it. It's not your responsibility what they spend it on. Your responsibility is just to fulfill your side of the bargain, that you agree that you will pay a certain amount, and you do enough to comply with that at the minimum standard. And then what they spend it upon is also not your sin necessarily, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. What's the ruling on a husband not wanting children? Although before getting married we agreed we would have children, but after 4 years he still says not now. He has no valid reason with regard to money or health. This is not permissible for him to do this. This is haram, and it's haram upon him, and it's a dhulm, it's an oppression upon his wife. It's not permissible for him to do that. And if that's the case, that he doesn't have any reason or any concern, even if he has a reason, Islamically, the reasons for not wanting to have children are very limited and restricted. And it's like, maybe you can say spacing out pregnancies or something like that. But this idea that, I just don't want to have children, or I don't think we're financially stable, this is not something that comes from Islam. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Tazawwaju al-wadud al-walud, فَإِنِّي مُكَاثِرٌ بِكُمُ الْأُمَمِ." He said that marry a woman who is loving and will bear you many children, because I will boast of your large numbers. It's not for him to say that, and it's not allowed even if he agreed before marriage or didn't agree before marriage. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullu shartin laysa fi kitabillahi fahuwa batil." Every condition that isn't in agreement with the Book of Allah is falsehood. So it's not allowed for a person to make a condition to say that they don't want to have children. That's not something that they're allowed to do. So they have to change that position of theirs and change that way of thinking. And instead, they have to accept that having children is an important part of marriage in Islam. And it's a right of the wife to expect that her husband will do his best for them to be able to have children. And it's not allowed for him to prevent that without an Islamic reason. I'd already answered that question. Another question. Okay, this is probably the last question I will deal with today. We have a lot of questions, subhanAllah. The questions became a lot, but this is a good question. There's a colleague at work who is homosexual. and is interested in what Islam says about this. They've heard about stoning gay people in Arab countries. I have to be careful on how I approach this topic as it can be seen as homophobic in the workplace. How should I approach this situation? I think it's really important that we don't lie to people or try to sweeten something for people that it isn't, like there's no sort of way to make it, or it's not right for us to sort of apologize and sort of make excuses for Islam and say, oh, actually, there is an opinion that this is not correct. But I think that we have to be honest. And I think that you should say that. You should say, if you feel you can't say that, it's better you don't talk to them about it at all. Wallah, it's better you don't talk to them about it at all if you can't say what needs to be said. But the way you say, yes, you can choose the right words for it to be understood, but don't try to sweeten it for them. We say that, first of all, in Islam, that this is something which is from the major sins. And we are told about the people of Lut and what happened to them, and that Allah Azza wa Jal sent down upon them stones from the heavens, and he turned the city upside down because of the evil that they did and the homosexuality that they practiced. And that was the reason for the punishment that came to the people of Lut. And so this is not something that in Islam we think is acceptable in any way, and it's a major sin. And that's what it is. And if he says, is there a punishment for it? There is a punishment for it. There is a punishment for it, because ultimately anything which is such a severe sin, which has such a great harm upon society, and which, if Allah Azza wa Jal punished the people of Lut for doing it, then of course in the Islamic system where you have laws that prohibit the things that are wrong, then there will be laws that prohibit homosexuality and which punish it. And that's understandable if it is the case that we're saying it's something that's a great evil and a great wrong and a great harm that comes to people. Then you can't then say, but it's okay, like it doesn't matter if you do it, or we should let people do whatever they want. Islam is consistent in that way. Islam is consistent like that in across the board in everything. Islam is anything which causes a major harm and major evil for people is prohibited by Islam, and many times those prohibitions they come with punishments to deter people from doing it. And I think that you don't have to use those words that I used, but I think that you have to tell them the truth. You can't sweeten it for them and say, yeah, it's not really right, but there are some Muslims who don't think that, and this is not a matter that you can differ over. It's a matter which the scholars of Islam, they did not differ in even one of them in this matter. This is something which is universally accepted by the proof from the Quran and from the Sunnah and from the consensus of the scholars. So we have to be, we have to call a spade at the end of the day and tell people what it's really like. But you choose whether you think that if someone asks you, you have to tell the truth. You can't conceal the truth. Someone comes to you and says to you, say it loud. But whether you engage them in a discussion or not, or whether you just say, look, it's something that's absolutely not allowed in Islam, it's considered to be a major sin, and that's it. That it depends whether you think that the end result of that conversation is going to be net positive or not. Like, in other words, is the end conversation going to be that you end up getting labeled as homophobic, that this person becomes even worse, in what they're doing? If that's the end conversation, then I think that you just tell them the truth, one line, and just let it go. But if you think that you can potentially have a positive impact upon the person and explain Islam to them and make them feel closer towards accepting Islam and realizing what they've done, then inshallah this is worth speaking to somebody about. And I've seen both cases. I've had people come to me who have talked to me about this with a very open mind, who have said, I understand it's not allowed in Islam, and to explain to me why. And there have been people who don't want to know, who are just like, they just want to talk about how oppressed they are and how terrible it is and so on. So I think if it's that kind of situation, you just give them one line answer that it's a major sin and it's not allowed. And that's it. And don't kind of get involved in a discussion where you're just simply going to basically just be a reason for this person to almost bully you, for this person to basically just start saying, well, would I be stoned? Would I be stoned to death? Would I be thrown from the top of a building or something like that? This person is just waiting, just trying to fight with you. And so look, as I've said to you, it's a major sin in Islam, and it's something which holds a severe punishment in this world and in the hereafter. No, that's enough. And say, like, in terms of us in the UK, somebody says, is that your position at work? So I'm a Muslim. I believe what I believe, but at the end of the day, we all have to comply with whatever laws that there are in this country. We have to stick to that. We can't do anything about it. But I'm not going to change what I believe. So this is why the danger is that when you start down this road, if you can't manage it, it just ends up into you being, labeled as being homophobic and so on, and getting problems in the workplace and so on. So maybe it is better just to give one line. It's not allowed and it's a major sin, and that's it. But if you think this person genuinely could come to Islam and could realize what they're doing and could actually change, then yeah, you can engage in a proper conversation about it. But you shouldn't try to sweeten it for them at all, or you shouldn't try to hide what Islam actually says about it. Is it permissible, last couple of questions, is it permissible to take state benefits from the government? Yes, it's permissible to take state benefits from the government, because in general in Islam, it's an obligation of the government to spend upon people who need it. Social, like the welfare and welfare payments. This is an obligation upon the government in Islam. So there is no harm in taking benefits from them in that way, as long as you only take what you have a right to. No. I think we'll stop there, inshallah ta'ala. But inshallah, we'll try for next week to answer some more. At the moment, we're up to 129 out of 172. So that's there's still a lot of questions still to go. We'll try our best next week, inshallah, to answer some more. Let me see if we had any questions in the comments here. Did the Prophet ﷺ say Islam is not grey, it's either black or white or something like that? I don't know of a hadith like that. I mean, I would say to the brother who asked, I think it's brother Ja'far, this is a difficult one because there are many, many hadith. There are, just in the Kutub al-Sitta, there are 33,000 hadith if you include repetition. So it could be that you miss a hadith. I'm not going to claim that I know all of the hadith or every single hadith, but I haven't come across a hadith that says Islam is not grey, it's either black or white. What I found is a hadith, إِنَّ الْحَلَالَ بَيِّنٌ وَإِنَّ الْحَرَامَ بَيِّنٌ وَبَيْنَهُمَا أُمُورٌ مُشْتَبِهَاتٌ لَا يَعْلَمُهُنَّ كَثِيرٌ مِنَ النَّاسِ. The halal is clear and the haram is clear. And between them are grey areas that not a lot of people know. فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِيهَا وَقَعَ فِي الْحَرَامِ. And whoever avoids the grey areas has saved their honor and their religion, and whoever falls into them has fallen into the haram. So this maybe could be this hadith that people talk about, the hadith of Nu'man ibn Bashir, that the halal is clear and the haram is clear. Maybe if someone was translating it a bit literally, they might say that there's black and white, there's halal and haram, and then there's grey areas. Maybe that's the hadith you're referring to. Could I also do live video on my YouTube channel? At the moment, my YouTube channel, I use it for very specific things. So this Q&A is something the masjid asked me to do for the masjid. They asked me to do it for the masjid. But as for sort of my YouTube channel, I try to use that for the classes specifically, like the tafsir class and the Bulugh al-Maram class. So we try to keep it like that, so that there's a distinction between the two. Because this was what the masjid asked. But if the masjid was able to stream this onto their own Facebook or their own YouTube account, I wouldn't have a problem with that, inshallah. We can see if it's possible. I know that at the moment we're kind of limited with the technology that we have, being able to. So at the moment I'm just using just the computer with a webcam at the moment. But we'll see if we can, inshallah, organize something like that from the point of view of the masjid, inshallah. And Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.